אכלת בכדורן זוגי ולא חבר.
זה מרגש פיזיולוגית, זה פשוט מגיע ויש לך הפתעה כל פעם מחדש. מי מלמד אותנו?
I'm not sure.
Oh, maybe that was next class. No, next class we have presentation. That's not a whole lot. איך נתנו חברים? 1 hour.
But is there one?
על האקסטר חברים והיו מפגרים כדי להזמין אותנו לבית שלהם שזה בעצם לא היה שלום בבית. כן, זה היה בבית של כאילו קרובי משפחה שלהם שגרים כאילו כמה בלוגים
של פיטר כאילו?
ואנחנו באנו דפקנו בדלת והם היו בבית אבל במקרה הם באו לבדוק מה קורה עם הכלבה שלהם יבוא על דיווחים ואז עשיתי הקדית אותי הארוחת מאחרת כאילו מאחרת 8 אנשים בהתחלות כבר רמזתי 11 ופתאום כזה מוציאים לנו עכשיו כזה שרים ומשנים לנו כזה כזה מה, כאילו זה צדיק וזה אפילו לא, אני נשארתי בכלל
קצת חלק מהמהות שלנו, לא?
שמה?
כאילו חלק מהמהות שלנו כולם מוזמנים, כולם מוזמנים ללכת
כן, אבל כאילו זה עדיין לא נעים כזה שמשנים בשבילך עכשיו בכל האופציה
אין לנו שטות שמקליטה
למה?
אין פה את השטות שמקליטה מיקרופון אתמול העלינו במרונות מהחתונה של בדודה שלי והיא אמרה שאני לא זכרתי את זה היא אמרה שכאילו פולו משהו לפני החתונה שלנו אני לא מעניין את האירוע
את ידעת את זה?
אני כאילו 5 ומשהו ולא ישנתי טוב הלילה בכלל ישנתי כל הלילה וישנתי כל הלילה
לנו היה חורף
תשימי כזה
האור לא מרגיע אותם
לא, שביצון כזה שביצון וזה שהם משנים
שון אאוטריץ' נו האור הזה
לא, האור הזה אבל האור
הם לא עובדים אותו
Okay, just to remind you where we sort of finished last time, I'll just go briefly and sort of try to summarize where we were. Okay, just to remind you, we were talking about sort of processing at the level of primary visual cortex, and mentioning what has happened in primary visual cortex that did not happen already at the level of the retina, and that is that we get orientation tuning, right? And we discussed basically the overall functional organization of V1, primary visual cortex. And I mentioned briefly that we have these what's called simple cells and complex cells, which are orientation tuned, right? At different sort of, so they have different receptor field sizes from very small to very large ones. And accordingly also the preferred spatial frequency changes as you move from smaller receptor fields, which are typically at the center, at the fovea. So notice here, this sort of just gives you some idea of the organization V1. So at the fovea, central vision, you have the finest receptor field, smallest, and as you move to the periphery, they're becoming bigger. And then I mentioned in a few words that you have both the simple cells and the complex cells being the ones which are sort of phase independent. So they respond just as well to such a stimulus than to the opposite one. So they're phase independent, and simple cells are phase dependent. And then I mentioned briefly, let me be more effective in a minute. This works. It doesn't. Great, that's not very effective. What happened? Okay, mentioned this, and then I went on to describe something about the contrast sensitivity function. Remember? So, contrast sensitivity function, just to describe this. Blah, 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 further on here. Okay, so you can think about this as moving from low spatial frequencies to higher spatial frequencies, meaning that the bars become smaller, right? And here you're changing the contrast from high contrast to low contrast. And as I mentioned, that you can sort of, when you eyeball this, tell when can't you tell when the bars are or the lines are. So somewhere here, because the contrast is minimal, but if you notice probably at this stage here, depending on your distance, you can still see this, and then it sort of blurs again as you're moving to lower spatial frequencies. And I mentioned something about, okay, so this is what I just showed you. You can do this and test how well can you tell if there's a sort of sinusoid grading or not on the screen. And what you get is this function here, plotted here in black. That's called the contrast sensitivity function. Okay, it describes your sensitivity. The y-axis is your contrast sensitivity. The higher meaning you need less of a contrast to detect the grading. And you see that this drops dramatically as you go to higher and higher frequencies. At some point you can't tell this. Well, we didn't get to this point here, but if you move to higher frequencies, you would not be able to tell this. Okay, so they blend, and you cannot tell them. Okay, and then I mentioned very briefly at the end of my talk something about adaptation. So what if you now take a subject, and we'll see in a minute, I'll give you a demo of this, and you adapt to a specific frequency. So I show you a grading of a specific frequency for, let's say, a minute or so, and then I test how well can you detect gradings at different frequencies. So what you get is, okay, a reduction in performance, but that's specific to the frequency that you have been adapting to. Okay, so you've been adapting to the arrow here points to the specific of this grating, the frequency of this grating, and you see that there's a drop here, but it's specific. It doesn't affect your ability to detect a grating at high spatial frequencies or very low ones. It's just specific to the frequency that you've been using, but it's not punctually specific. There's some bandwidth to this, right? And this is plotted here. So you see if you've adapted to, I don't know, 6 cycles per degree here, there's sort of a threshold elevation, meaning a drop in sensitivity, which is maximal for the frequency that you've been adapting to, and it drops down as you move away from it, okay? That suggests what? That there's a channel. You can think about these as channels, spatial frequency channels, each one sensitive to a different spatial frequency, right? Okay. And now, this is where I left you in the last lesson, and hopefully now we will understand this better. What do we see here? We see a famous experiment done by Campbell and Robson already, 50 years ago, okay? In which what they've done is a very nice experiment, very innovative, and that is, okay, remember I told you can use a sort of a grating at different frequencies. Well, once you can use a grating, which is a sine wave grating, but in another case you can use a square wave grating. What do I mean by a square wave? That it changes abruptly, right? And here there's a sine, so there's a sinusoid of the sort of the luminance as a function of position. Okay, now I'll give you the results. And who has heard about the Fourier transform? We talked about this last time. But if you know something about the Fourier transform, you should be able to sort of, let's think about this together. It may be difficult to figure out, but let's look at the results first, okay? And what do we see here? So again, that's the contrast sensitivity function. That's a spatial frequency here, and this is the contrast sensitivity, higher meaning better sensitivity. And what you can see here is 2 functions, right? So look, the triangles depict the contrast sensitivity for the, let's see, open triangles, contrast sensitivity to the square waves, okay? And the filled circles, the ones below it, are for the sine, okay? The sine wave. Okay, so notice that the triangles at each point are somewhat higher than the square wave. And I'll give you a hint. You can plot here the ratio between these two values, okay? So the ratio corresponds to 4 over pi, okay? So there's a constant ratio here, and it seems to be now diverging from that constant ratio as you move to very, very, very low frequencies. Okay? That's the basic finding. Am I the only one who's hot here? Probably, because I'm the one who's giving the lecture. So typically that would be the case. Okay. When you get hot, let me know, because I'm fine at the moment. Okay, so you see here that the point number 1, the triangles are constantly above the circles, and it's not just noise, because you see this for every point here, and they diverge from this ratio of 4 over pi for very, very low frequencies. Well, how do we understand this? Okay, I started mentioning this. It's a better demonstration than what I tried to do before. You have a square wave. How do you fit a square wave using what's called the Fourier series? Well, basically, you can think about this as sort of a sum of infinite number of frequencies starting from the fundamental frequency. So here's f drawn here, okay? Now, you need to add 3f to generate these bumps here. See here? So 3f is 3 times the frequency of f, but its amplitude is 1/3 of f, okay? Now you want to approximate this square wave, you have to continue, okay? And then you use only the odd frequencies of f being the fundamental frequency, okay? So here's 5f drawn here, here's 7f, so this is 1/5 of f, this is 1/7 of f, so as you can tell, the amplitudes become smaller, okay? And your approximation of what f of what the square wave is gets better. Okay? But you would need an infinite number of these, you know, all the odd frequencies as you're moving, their contribution becomes smaller. Okay? So this is what's called the Fourier series. And as I said, in general, the Fourier transform says that you can describe any function, f of x, okay, as, we'll call it g of x, whatever, okay, so you have a function of position, g of x, I don't know, which looks something like that, g as a function of x, I don't know, you know what, let's call it I of x to make it clear. I is illumination, right? So you have some image here, and I'm just drawing a one-dimensional case to make it simple, where you can present the same data exactly using the Fourier transform. It's called using the FFT. And here, the action would be what? First it would be, so how are you presenting it? You're presenting this image here in terms of sinusoidal frequencies, okay? So it's a sum of sinusoidal frequencies. So here, the x-axis now would turn into, instead of x, it would be omega, meaning different frequency, okay? And here, you'd have the amplitude of different frequencies. So let's just give a simple example. Well, if we were to use this, we're using a square wave. I of x now looks something like that. Sorry, try to be. And so on and so forth. What would that be look? What would that look like? Any idea? Now we're talking about how do you represent this in terms of frequencies. Well, remember, okay, you're getting there, but it's not quite so, because remember, if you're representing you want to represent the square wave, there's just f, 3f, 5f, so it's not a line. Well, not quite. Let's think about this again. Okay, so here's the fundamental, let's call it f, here's 3f, here's 5f, and so on. Well, the amplitude of f would be the biggest, right? What would be the next one? 3f. It would be a third of f, right? And it should be delta functions. There's nothing in between. It's just f, 3f, 5f, and so on. What about 5f? It should be a fifth of f. 7f, okay, should be a seventh, and so on and so forth. So that's this is called the power spectra. Is this new to people? Power spectra of that specific square wave function that I just drew. Okay, now that's not complete because we need another aspect, and that is what? The phase spectra. Okay, so if you have, if this is completely new to people here. Okay, so when you're talking about, some of you may have heard the term phase, but let's say we're talking about this sinusoid here. We want to fit this to the square wave. Well, okay, so we need to define what is the right frequency. But the other thing is to move it so it would fit where it's on here, it should be in the maximum, right? So if I were to move this, it could be out of phase or in phase, right? Again, think about this. You take as the fundamental frequency, which looks like that. Well, if it's right, if it fits where it's going up, if the peak here, okay, what would be the right phase? The right phase would be, of course, to be drawn in a different color, but I think you understand, is something which looks like that. Right? That's the right phase. If I were to move this, it would be out of phase, okay? So there's two aspects here. First, what the frequency is. It's amplitude, okay? So the amplitude of the different frequencies, that's called the power spectra. And the other aspect is the phase spectra. So that is, let me show you what I mean. So here would be the phase. That would be between 0 and 2 pi, okay? And that would be omega again. And you'd have for each, say here for f, you'd have the phase, okay? So this would be between 0 and 2 pi. And so on, and that would be the phase here, and the phase, I don't know, 3f would be something else. I'm not talking about, okay, so this would be different values here. So I'm not getting into the actual values of the phase, but you can figure it out. Okay, they should be, as you see here, they should be at the opposite phase as this one. But never mind. Let's leave that aside. Okay, so point to take home. The take-home message is you can fit any function with these sinusoids. Okay, and now as we were fitting the square wave, you notice that well, if you would try to generate a square wave, well, the sine wave actually that you fit is actually bigger than the square wave. Okay, so if you use sine wave of the same amplitude, it would not fit what the actual amplitude of the sine wave that fits the square wave. Okay, so back to here. Well, okay, so now you're using here the same amplitude as you're using here. Okay, what do I mean by the same amplitude? Here's the amplitude is the peak to peak here of the sine wave and the square wave. That's the peak to peak of the square wave. Same amplitude. Okay? But to fit the square wave, we need a bigger amplitude at the sine wave. Therefore, okay, when we're using a square wave, the actual value, the amplitude of the sine wave that fits it is bigger. Okay? And that relationship is 4 over pi. Meaning that when you use a square wave, you have a bigger sine wave in it than when you're using the sine wave itself. Okay? Okay? So, the result is that you get a better performance for the square wave than for the sine wave. Okay? Okay? Okay. Now, last thing. Here's the tricky thing. So we understand now this. What about this? You completely lost me here. Are you with me? I mean, did you understand the idea here? Now, what about here? Here there's a divergence from the rule that I just told you. And why is this? Well, notice that as you're moving to lower spatial frequencies, your performance gets worse. It gets worse, okay? So your ability to tell very slow changing sine waves is much worse. Okay. Now I give you a square wave at very slow changes, okay? So very low frequency. So again, let me draw and explain. So you have something that looks like this. I don't know, and that's very low frequency here, okay? Well, the sensitivity, if I were to draw the sine wave of this, the sensitivity to this sine wave, since it's such a low frequency, is very low. Okay. Now you get to a point where the sensitivity to the 3F is much higher than the F. Okay, why? Because think, if you're here, the sensitivity is quite low, right? Now you're moving, let's say, from let's think from here, from 0.3 cycles per degree to 1 cycle per degree. That's a jump of 3, right? So you're moving from F to 3F, okay? What you find is that your sensitivity, which is measured here at the y-axis, changes more for 3F, much more for 3F than for 1F. How do we see that? It's growing here. Okay? Now at some point, let's say, if we have a square wave, we fit it with F and a third of the amplitude at 3F. Correct? Remember? So you have that's F, the sine wave, and then you have something at 3F, 1, 2, 3, okay, which is smaller. If this is F, this is 3F, and its amplitude, as I said, is a third of this one. But if the sensitivity for 3F is much larger, more than 3 times larger than F, then the result would be that you're going to detect that there's a square wave here, not based on F, but on 3F. Okay? 3F is small, okay, is smaller in amplitude. It's always too small. It's a third in amplitude of F. But if your sensitivity, let's say, is 10 times better for 3F, then clearly you're going to detect something based on 3F and not F. That's the point here. And therefore, this divergence here is because you're not using f, so the comparison is no longer relevant. What is your fundamental frequency in the square wave? And compare this with the sine wave. But what is you detect the square wave based on 3f, on the higher harmonic frequency. Okay? So that's where you get this divergence here. Now what's nice about this is that both of these can be predicted from the original function. Okay? And they fit well with this idea that you have a Fourier transform. Okay, that what the visual system does is a Fourier transform of the data looking at the different frequencies here, and it basically detects, okay, if there's a grading there based on this, on the energy at the different frequencies. So that was a key experiment done by Campbell and Robson, and I think it's really, really smart in terms of once you understand this. So this is a bit difficult. Who followed me? Is this something that I need to repeat? I mean, is this something, if there's any questions, ask me now, okay? Don't be shy, because that's your last chance. Yes, go ahead.
Then the connection between the contrast sensitivity to the divergence.
I didn't hear what you said.
The
What?
last part.
The last part. About
Why
this?
yes.
Okay. So this part is clear? Okay. Now the last part here is because when you have a sort of a square wave function, let's go back maybe to see this. When you have a square wave, sorry, let's see where did I? Okay. When you have a square wave, you can now approximate it with a sum of different frequencies. So the odd frequency, the fundamental frequency, 3f, 5f, and so on. Now we know 3f, its amplitude is much smaller than f. So usually, in most cases, you're going to detect if there's a stimulus there based on f, because it's 3 times as big as 3f. But if you move to a very, very low frequencies, you notice that there's a drop in sensitivity. So we're not very good at telling sinusoids when they change very slowly. Now, if you're presenting me not with a sine wave, but with a square wave, what I can use now is instead of f, I can detect that there's a square wave there based on 3f. Now, usually I don't do this because its amplitude is much smaller. It's a third of what it is in f. Okay? But when you go to very low frequencies, your sensitivity for 3f is much better than for f. It's in fact, it has to be at least 3 times as better as f. Okay? Once it's bigger than 3 times than f, then you will be detecting this sinusoid here, the square wave here, based on 3f and not based on f. That's what happens here. Okay? So that's the point to the take-home message. Okay. Now, I want to say a few words about this adaptation that I mentioned before. And now here's, just stay here on the red sign here. You can move your eyes back and forth. And we'll do this for a few more seconds. Okay. And now what do you see here compared to here? So if you were to do this correctly, I would expect that you see here that the bars here are bigger in size than they were here. Did you notice this? Okay, once again, I'll do it myself with you just to make sure that this can be, okay? Yeah, I think, well, yeah. Typically you need to do this for a minute or so, okay? So I was just saving time because I want to get to this lesson to motion processing. So, and the idea here is that you have adaptation, and you see it's specific. So how do we understand this? Well, think about this. Remember I mentioned the point about having these frequency tuned channels, right? So you can think about this, the spatial frequency here, and say, here's the sensitivity of these different channels. So the highest sensitivity at mid-range, low sensitivity for high frequency, and low sensitivity for low frequency. And so once you give us a test stimulus, if there's no adaptation, then this and the test stimulus is at this mid frequency, that's what you'd expect to get, right? So you're going to get strong response from the channel which is closest in frequency to the frequency that you present, and something which looks like that. Okay, now if you are to present a stimulus adapt to a low frequency, okay, so somewhere here, and then you test. Well, you adapt these channels here corresponding to the low spatial frequency. So you see there's a drop here in their activity, okay, and the further you are, there's not much of an effect here, okay, because that's further away, right? And then if you give the same test stimulus as we've shown here, so what we see here, I give you the same test stimulus here, but here you've adapted to low spatial frequency, here you've adapted to high spatial frequency, right? And so what you see here is the effect. Okay, if you adapt to low spatial frequency, you're going to reduce the responses of these low spatial frequency channels, result in a skewed distribution to the right. And if you adapt to high spatial frequency, they're going to affect these channels here, okay? And you're going to get a skewed distribution to the left, okay? So this distribution gives you information about what to expect. It generally explains these adaptation effects that I was talking about here. That if you adapt to this stimulus, you're going to see this same grading as a high spatial frequency, because you've adapted to low spatial frequency here, while here you've adapted to high spatial frequency. You're going to see this grading as consisting of lower spatial frequency. Okay, so that's basically the idea here. That again, pointing out that there's these spatial frequency channels that you can adapt each of them, okay, and get an effect due to the adaptation of specific channels. And basically, the idea that people have come to following these sort of this reasoning is that you can have a stimulus. It could be a grading, but it could be any stimulus here. And you can think about this as, what is V1 doing? Well, it's passing this stimulus through a series or in parallel different filters, okay? So remember we talked about convolution kernels, right? When we were talking about the retina and LGN. So you can think about these filters. So what are these filters on the retina? Just to see if you remember something. You don't remember anything. Set this around, right? Remember we talked about the difference of Gaussians and the second derivative, same thing, right? And here, what are they? These filters are already oriented filters, okay? Oriented filters, different spatial frequencies, okay? So here's your filter, series of filters. They're corresponding, just to make the point, that they're corresponding to these, right? These are, okay? You can think of these receptor fields. Each of them is a filter that the image is passed through this filter, okay? Sorry for jumping forward, okay? So here's a convolution kernels. They are present on each position in space, okay? So map all of the visual field. So you have sort of a convolution with this function, with that function, so on and so forth. And okay, after you convolve this, so you have the stimulus, you convolve this with these filters, there's a nonlinearity, typically in terms of that you need some level of, say, difference for this. There's a threshold, and there's typically sort of a saturation here that you can see. And then there's some noise, and that sort of, the information from all these filters is sort of basically added in order to come to a decision if there was a stimulus there or not. Okay, if there was a sort of, in that case, if there was a sinusoid grading or not. Okay. Okay. And so this is basically the idea of the present idea of how can we think about V1. So you notice it's somewhere in between the Fourier transform and sort of the edge detector that Yuval and Wiesel were talking about. In the sense that if you think about the Fourier transform is at every position in space. right? Okay, so the Fourier transform you're doing at every position in space, while these filters are specific to a specific position in space. Okay, so if you're saying, okay, let's put it this way. So if you're talking about V1, you notice that the receptive fields are somewhat small. So each of these receptive fields is a filter for a specific position in space. Okay, and they are changing as you move from the center to further periphery. Okay, in terms of eccentricity, that's what you can see here. Okay, so you can see here the change in the receptive field as a function of the receptive field's center. So it's smallest at the center, and as you're moving away, it's becoming bigger. If you're moving to V2, V4, and so on along the hierarchy, as we will discuss in a minute, you see that the same rule remains. Okay, best resolution at the fovea, as was the case already at the retina, right? And as you're moving, the receptive field is becoming bigger, and the slope is actually bigger at V2 and in V4, meaning that these receptors are not sort of drawn here, that the receptive field sizes become bigger as you move into the periphery. Okay, so that's point number one. And then there's this issue of how do you combine information from simple cells and complex cells. I'll just mention one point here, which we will get back to in your talks in a week or a little more than that. And that is, okay, what's happening beyond V1? Well, the first thing to think about is, of course, in V1, all we care about, basically the cells care about, is local contrast, right? There may be these filters, there may be phase sensitive, there may be phase insensitive, but it's basically local contrast, oriented contrast, right? Okay. But as we're moving further away, one thing you can think about this, well, I can generate images that have the same local contrast, but sometimes you understand them to be having some structure, like this beehive here, or these, I don't know, whatever, can't remember the name in English. Anyway, some vegetables here or whatever, but you can generate a similar image, and I'm not getting into the details, which has the same local statistics, same local contrast statistic, which is, so this has the V1 filters, like filters match. So this image and this image would be the same as far as V1 is concerned, because all they're interested in is local contrast here. But we interpret this as being a natural image, of course, and this is just, okay, noise, right, visual noise. Well, in terms of V1, you won't be able to tell the difference, right? In terms of V1, they're equal, okay? Because that's how they're generated. You make sure that, remember that I talked about this array of filters here. Well, the output of these array of filters will be the same as far as V1 is concerned. But as you go further on, so here you can compare naturalistic textures versus natural images, okay? So you compare response to this one and to this one, okay? And the way you do this, won't get into the details, but you can generate these images which are becoming, using basically a sort of a iterative process. So you start with something which looks very different from this beehive, but as you move further and further, you get to the point where it's very similar. It's not the same, but it has the same image statistics, okay? And basically the point here is that if you look at V1, you get the same response for this stimulus, the original beehive, and this sort of naturalistic texture, but it's not, you can immediately detect that it's not the beehive, right? The same here. Take this one, and I don't know, is there another example here? This maybe is similar to this one. Never mind the details. The story is that you see that the responses are the same at V1. So there are the green lines here. That's basically response to a stimulus presented between 0 and, I don't know, 200 milliseconds. So you see here the increase in firing when you present the stimulus, but there's no difference between the original stimulus and the sort of the noise, which has similar image statistics. But in V2, you do see this difference. Okay, so something now arises at higher level So if you compare the naturalistic to the noise, you see that in V2 there's clear difference, while in V1 there's no difference. Okay, so that's one example of something, of the information extracted beyond V1. Okay, and for lack of time, I won't get into this. I'll just say that you can see the same thing when you're using functional imaging. So I mentioned, okay, that functional imaging, although you do not basically detect directly neural activity, but rather the blood response, okay, the hemodynamic response, you can see that you get similar results using fMRI in humans. When you compare V2 to V1, you see that, you know, for these images here, when you compare the images, you know, the original images to the sort of naturalistic sort of noise here, then you see again that in V2, the red areas here and V3 correspond to voxels in which there's a difference between the two. Okay, so you basically replicate what we've seen in the monkey before, and this is the modulation index. Modulation index being 0, meaning that there's no difference between the two conditions, and positive, meaning there's a difference between the two conditions. You can see that in V2 there is a clear modulation index, while in V1 much less for the 3 different subjects shown here. Okay, just like here you see that, you know, on average for the neurons there's hardly any modulation between the two. Here's the modulation index close to 0 here, but you look at V2, there's a clear shift of the modulation index to the right, meaning that they differentiate between the beehive and the noise having the same statistics as the beehive. Okay? I've run out of time, so we'll start we'll take a break now, start the next lesson a little early because we need to get into the motion processing that I was planning for today. Okay. כן.
חוץ מ-V1 אותו דבר, איך זה יכול להיות שונה בביצוע? ביצועים אחרים או שזה כאילו מקבל?
אוקיי, זו נקודה מצוינת. כיוון שאתם תציגו את הדברים האלה, אני לא כאילו, יהיה לכם סמינר על זה, חבר'ה שלכם, אני צריך לדבר איתם, ואנחנו כן, זה בכלל נקודה מרכזית. אוקיי, זה יכול להוציא אינפורמציה. מאיפה אתה חושב, מאיפה מוציאים את האינפורמציה הזאת? אם היא לא קיימת ב-V1, איך אנחנו מוצאים? לא רוצה. לשמור אותה בתחתיות. לא יודע, אני פה באתי 9. לא ראיתי אותו פה, לא היה פה. לא היה פה, אז הגעתי קצת 3 דקות מאוחר, באתי, נכנסתי והתחלתי. מה? לא, אני בשמחה, אני לא מבין למה. אמור להיות פה. חבל שלא אמרת בהתחלה. אין כוונה לא להפריד.
We can make, it's a good idea, maybe we'll talk together, see what we both understand together. And then, what are the questions, or let's make up a whole bunch of questions.
My feeling is like, je pense que je l'enverrai. Ouais. Mais quand tu me donnes pas la moitié, non, j'ai global, je vais faire. Parce que c'est pour ça. Je pense qu'on peut le faire, on a la convection qu'il faut. Même en une soirée, je pense. Ouais. Ce soir, c'est possible, peut-être que ce sera là.
Also, it's also about quantum fighters, I don't know if it's success like that.
So looking into maybe
And taking these pattern trajectory, the trajectory that now we've talked about, quantum fighters, parallel fibers,
et la correction, elle est
I read it twice, and I have a basic idea that it's really, they're trying to say, if I understand it correctly, that, I always forget what it is. Yes, is that I think it's sort of like, it doesn't happen as a result of what, it's not like what a result of the physics requirements are. It's sort of like, it's already predicts what the physics requirements is gonna be and already changes ahead of time. I think that's what they're trying to say. Right? Right? But they're trying, but, and how they prove it and how they do it, and I don't know, I'm thinking of maybe talking, maybe sort of like I'll ask.
Soit on fait adaptation.
If I can talk with Charles that.
Ouais, soit.
I think maybe that'll,
Pardon,
I don't know.
non.
Although
Pour l'instant, on te
he's
divisé en
teaching
trois.
about working fibers and now and Bell and all that.
Donc toi, t'as fait la une.
Here,
Toi, tu commences la une. Toi, tu peux faire la deux, moi, je sais sur la trois.
But I really, I don't know, I'm wondering, yeah, I guess we'll see how others present theirs, but I think the critique question, you're talking about critique, I don't know, that's not a major, I think we're not on the level to do critique, in my opinion, I'm not. It's the trying for everyone's understanding, like, we can have, like, talk about, give like extra deductions from other stuff that, people understand, because everyone's not gonna, I imagine, most people won't understand too much unless we give a much more, we got 45 minutes. Yeah, like explain all the basic things, at the same time, we give them stuff what's happening, I'd be very happy to do that. Doing that. So give like the basic stuff, and then start to, tell what they're trying to do. And then we have some, try to get some basic idea there to see, but also, of course, not going into details. That's not unfortunate, but we still have to understand it. I don't understand. And then the basic, and then of course, results, results, the graph, discuss the results, and get to some conclusions in the end, and I think but I think the most important part is the beginning part. We can do half and half the beginning part. Whatever, we'll have a choice. If you like, can do all the beginning, you can do materials and methods, I think we have to do something very general. Give the principle, because the principle really is they understand why the graph. Yeah, but even that I really, I mean, I try to understand it. Here, in black and white, you don't really see it. I sort of like saw that the what, I already forgot, I read it like last week, but I already saw like, that you see a difference in the fire. What is, moving
דן. אפילו צייר. יש לך את הסקוואר ווייב ויש לך את הסיין. עכשיו, כשאת לוקחת, עכשיו מה שאת עושה, אז את זורקת את ה-CSF.
כן.
אוקיי? אז את עושה את ה-CSF, אז זה פה Spatial Frequency, וזה Sensitivity, ויש לך משהו נראה ככה, נכון? זה הצ'פר.
כן.
זה לסיין ווייב. זה לסיין ווייב.
כן.
עכשיו, כשאת עושה לסקוואר ווייב הוא יותר טוב. סקוואר ווייב יושב פה ככה.
נכון, אני זוכרת את זה מהשיעור הקודם.
אוקיי?
נכון.
עכשיו, כשאת לוקחת את היחס ביניהם, היחס מתאים ל4 חלקי פאי. למה? כי כשאת לוקחת ואת בונה סקוואר ווייב מסכום של סינוסואידים, אז יש לך את התדר F שהוא הכי גדול, או העוצמה שלו הכי גדולה. ואחר כך, אז יש לך את F. ואם תסתכלי, גם בצורה שציירתי פה, את רוצה לצייר סקוואר ווייב. את בונה אותו מ-F, אחר כך את לוקחת עוד 3F וכו' וכו', זה מה שהצעתי להסביר פעם. בצורה של 3F יש לכל האמפליטודה שלו הרבה יותר קטנה מאשר F. האמפליטודה שלו הוא בדיוק שליש מ-F. אבל שנית, בשביל להתאים סקוואר ווייב, התנועה שהסיין ווייב שלך הוא יותר גדול. הוא יותר גדול באמפליטודה. אוקיי? אז עכשיו, אם את לוקחת סיין ווייב שהוא באותו אמפליטודה כמו הסקוואר ווייב, אז הביצוע שלך יהיה פחות טוב. כי הסיין ווייב שנמצא, את לוקחת את הסקוואר ווייב, את אומרת, אוקיי, הסקוואר ווייב מורכב מכמה סיין ווייב שונים. הסיין ווייב, הבסיסי שלו, האמפליטודה שלו היא יותר גדולה מאשר הסיין ווייב של הסקוואר ווייב, האמפליטודה של הסקוואר ווייב, זה זאת. זה האמפליטודה של הסקוואר ווייב. מפה עד פה, מפה עד פה זה האמפליטודה שלו. הסיין ווייב זה הדבר הזה פה. כי למה? יש לו אובר, שאתה תפצה על זה על ידי שב3F הוא יוריד אותו.
נכון, אבל איך האמפליטודה משפיעה על הביצוע?
כי ככל שהאמפליטודה יותר גדולה, אז הסיכוי לזהות יותר גדול, נכון? מה זה האמפליטודה? זה אומר, זה הקונטרסט, זה מתייחס לקונטרסט.
אבל אמרנו שבסקוואר זה...
ההמשך לא מעבד, אז לא נעים לי מאחרים.
למה זה דווקא 4 חלקי פאי? למה זה דווקא תמיד אותו דבר?
כי זה הנוסחה. זה הנוסחה. כן, כן, כן. אני לא נכנסתי בכלל למתמטיקה בהינתן ראיתי שזה לא בדיוק הקהל המתאים לזה. כן, הנוסחה זה 4 חלקי פאי. Sorry, I didn't record my previous lecture. Maybe that was a good idea. Anyway, now I will. Can you hear me? I guess you can hear me without this as well. Okay, so I hope you got a glimpse of processing, what's the processing that's being done in V1. So basically we can think about this as sort of, as I said, oriented edges, you know, sort of a map of the oriented edges, or another way to look at this is to look at this from the Fourier analysis and to say, okay, an analysis at the different spatial frequencies of again, sort of spatial frequencies at different orientations. And as we said, this serves as the sort of the input for other areas that can extract higher level features which are relevant for visual analysis, as I described in my first lecture in the introduction. Okay, now specifically I want to talk about visual motion analysis. The reason being because I think this is sort of a key example where we have some information about what's being done and compare this with sort of single neurons. And I start with just giving you sort of a glimpse of information processing at the different levels in visual cortex. So this is just to, I was mentioning before V2 and V4. This is sort of a tree which sort of depicts some of the areas. In the macaque, there's more than 30 areas, so I didn't count here. There's probably, I don't know how many here, but I think there's more. There's actually more than mentioned here. And what you see on the left here is basically the brain of the macaque monkey. So just to orient you, this would be the back of the brain. Here's the eye. So you see, okay, the brain maybe is two times the size of the eye or something like that. Okay? And this is sort of a lateral view. And here what you see is a medial view. If you take the hemisphere, split them, look from the center. So here's the medial view. And the colored areas are the visual areas. So you see that, visual cortex is about 25 to 30% of the cerebral cortex is dedicated to visual analysis. And here you see basically sort of an atlas of this brain. So you can take this, the cerebral cortex, which is, of course, a sort of a folded sheet inside the brain. I like to demonstrate it this way. So you need to put inside the skull. You need to put the cortex inside the skull. So you can think about this as a two-dimensional sheet, 2 millimeters wide, thick, folded into the skull. Okay, so it looks something like that. And now what you can do is basically virtually present this as an atlas, just like we do for the atlas of the world. Okay, and this would correspond to the different cortical areas that you see here. Here's the retina. Okay, so the information, we talked about this. The chiasma here, the optic tract, the LGN, optic radiation arriving at V1, and from then on, information moving along these pathways here. So there's two pathways, the ventral and the dorsal one, ventral and dorsal one. And here are the different areas in the monkey brain that are dedicated to vision. And what you see here is, again, the same areas, but now the width of these black lines here corresponds to the strength of the connection. Okay? So the strongest connection from V1 is to V2. Mind you, there's a backward connection which is just as strong as the forward one for each area. Okay? And you see here the split here. Would be the dorsal pathway, the ventral pathway, and you get an idea of how strong the connection is between each area. So there's not just a connection between V1 and V2. There's also one between V1 and V4, and also between V1 and MT, much smaller, and so on and so forth. And we're going to concentrate now on MT and MST here. Okay, so MT and MST would be right there. That's what's called the superior temporal sulcus. These are areas in the monkey which are sensitive to motion. Okay, and so here's just another depiction of this in much more fewer areas here. So you see there's the two pathways, the ventral and the dorsal, and we're going to talk about area MT here at the superior temporal sulcus. Okay, now let's see if this is work. No, it isn't, never mind. Point here is that most cells in area MT, something like 80% to 90% of the cells are direction selective. That was just a video from Yuval Weasel, but we don't really need this. Point is that if you take an oriented bar, move it in one direction, the cell fires strongly. If you move it in the opposite direction, it does not fire. So that means that it's direction selective. And as I said, the vast majority of the cells in MT are direction selective. Here's an example of this. So what you see here is the response to a random dot pattern. You'll see in a minute random dots, and they can either move, say, in different directions here. So what you see here is sort of a polar plot. The further you are from the center here means that the cell's firing more robustly, strongly. So you see that as you're moving the dots upwards and to the right, here's the PST histogram, the response. So you see that there's strong responses here. If you're moving the dots in the opposite direction, there's hardly any response. And this is sort of the tuning curve showing that the cell is indeed tuned to a specific direction, although it has some broad tuning. Okay? Another point to notice, and that's drawn here, is of course the cell, just like in V1 and anywhere in the retina, it has a receptor field. It does not respond to dots everywhere in the visual field. It responds to the dots when these are presented at a specific location in the visual field. Now, typically, again, like in V1, the right hemisphere responds to stimuli presented at the left visual field. And here's just an example. So here's the receptor field of that cell here, showing that it's responsive to the right visual field, meaning it's in the left hemisphere. Okay? So it's direction selective, and it's selective to a specific position in space. Now, how do you build this? Well, you can think about this, this motion detector going back to Reichardt in 1956. He showed that, okay, you can think about this as sort of as the motion detector you can build from these specific detector. All you need to do is to generate a delay line, okay? So think about the sort of the visual stimulus first occurring here, then occurring here. Well, if this signal, okay, so it occurs here, it now activates this detector here. And then it occurs here, activating that detector later in time. Well, if you delay the line from the early on by a given delta t, and you ask if this is where the motion detection will be, you're asking here that there will be sort of both this detector and that detector would be active at the same time in order to get an output from this one. Then you get a motion detector. Let me draw it here just to make it clear. So what are we thinking of? You introduce some nonlinearity by having, okay, here's detector A, here's B here, and C is combining information from both of them. So that's sort of a summing information from both of them. And what you generate is some delay, delta t, from the input from one of them. Okay? So now, if you're activating A first and then B, okay, you're activating A, a spike is generated here. Okay? Activating B, a spike is generated somewhat later here. Right? But because there's a delay here, they converge at the same time at C. Okay? Now, if you're activating B first and then A, then you're not going to get firing. Why? Because, okay, now the spike is first at B, and then, only then, in A. And there's also a delay here. Okay? So A is much later than B, resulting in no coincidence in C. So C is this coincidence detector, and it fires only if these inputs arrive simultaneously. Okay? And by this is sort of the basic idea in which you can generate sort of a motion detector. Okay, and yeah.
Delta T is just the differences in time that you introduce the stimulus to A and B.
Okay. Good point here. Delta T, how would delta T affect our detector here? Let's put it this way. Yeah, delta T, okay, so you have, of course, the time between A and B is dependent on what? On the velocity of the stimulus, right? So the time here is in terms of, you can think about, A and B are separated in space by delta x of, I don't know, 5 degrees, okay? Now, the velocity would determine, okay, delta t would determine the velocity to which the cell is sensitive to, right? So why? Because it's the velocity is delta x divided by delta t, right? So if delta t is very small, okay, you would need a high velocity. And if delta t is very big, the cell will be tuned to slower velocities, okay? So that's an important point to be aware of. Okay, another point I want to mention is the aperture problem. The aperture problem is the fact that, okay, if you are to take, say, an aperture, which is the way you can think about cells, they're sensitive to a specific position in space, in the visual field, okay? Now, well, you can take sort of this grating here and move it in this direction here, across the aperture, okay? So you're going to see this sort of movement. And now, you take the same, another grating, which is not this, but this one here, and you move it upwards. Well, across the aperture, you're going to see movements to the left, okay, normal to the orientation of the grating. So you're not going to be able to tell if it's this one or that one. So that's one, and I'm sorry, my laptop's gone and so I don't have the demo to show you this because of I did not have time to move the videos. Okay, but trust me that these two, you can Google this. Just write the aperture problem demo, and you'll see this. Okay, better than I will show you this. So, but you can just think about this. This is called also the barber pole illusion. Sure. How many of you have been to the States to see this sort of same sort of so in the States, if you go to the barber pole, it has this pole, and you have sort of a grating moving through this pole, and it's called also the barber pole illusion. Check it out. And to make things concise here, these both give you the same result. So you don't know if the movement was actually this way or that way. Okay? Meaning that at the level of a single cell, you will not be able to solve this aperture problem. Okay? Similar here, if you move this way, again, what you see is the grating moving in this direction. Okay? So that's the aperture problem at the level of the cells. How do you solve this? Well, it's been something that people have studied in quite detail. I'm just giving you the feel for this. Okay, well, you can think about this. Well, let's say that you have a stimulus which looks this sort of rectangular stimulus here. Well, if you think about this edge here, you can only tell, as I said here, the normal direction to the orientation here. So think about an edge, a contour here. You can tell that vector, but you don't know if it's this one or that one, because all you can measure is that vector. You don't know what the vector is in the direction of the sort of orientation of the contour here. So it could be this one, could be this one, could be this one. As I said, you don't know if the movement is actually this one, or that one. All you know is the vector along normal to these lines here. Okay, so that you do know. But now if you have another edge here, well, all you know is that vector here. It could be any of these. But if you look at the intersection of these two constraints, you can solve the problem. So the idea is that by using an intersectional constraint, you can solve the aperture problem. So it's a bit sophisticated. For lack of time, I won't get into this. I'm just raising some problems that are problems in sort of vision that have been dealt with. But I'm well aware that I did not take enough time to explain this. I just hope that you understand what the problem is at least. Okay, and that is a problem at the level of the cells. As I said, with the point I was trying to say is, okay, just to clarify, here's one such receptor field, here's another such receptor field. By taking, okay, from this receptor field, you know the normal direction here. From that receptor field, you know the normal direction here. Okay? By applying these, you can solve the problem, the aperture problem. Okay. And now I want to get to the main. So this was sort of just a brief introduction to the issue of motion perception. And I want to talk about the most classical studies that have been done in the 90s by Bill Newsom and his group, in which what they looked at is random dot stimuli. Okay, so random dot stimuli, you can have these random dots. They could either move completely randomly, to have no correlation between them, or they could move consistently, let's say upwards here, so all the dots move upwards. That would be 100% correlation. And the nice thing about this stimulus is that you can play with its magnitude. Okay, so the more dots that are moving coherently, the stronger the motion signal is. Okay, so that's the basic idea. And now, what Bill Newsom has done is basically try to address the question is the following question. How good are we at detecting such stimuli? Okay? Again, for lack of time, I will not go into the videos, but you can maybe next time, if I'll have time, I'll prepare these. But you can think about these as random dots, okay? Some of them moving coherently, others not. You know what? It's worthwhile to see if I can actually see this. Just 1 minute. Is it here? No, it's not here. I'm sorry. Yeah, well, just because of... So I'll try to show you this in the following lecture. Doesn't really matter. I'm sure you've seen these sort of random dot patterns before. But the idea now that I want to address is, okay, given that you have these random dot stimuli, you can change the proportion of dots moving coherently. And the smaller they are, the more difficult it is to tell the direction of motion of the dots. And Bill Newsom and his group were thinking about, okay, let's compare single units and a monkey's performance. Okay, so how do you do this? You have a sort of a behaving monkey in which you present a stimulus at some position. Where would you present the stimulus? So now you're recording from a given cell in MT, where the cells are direction selective. Okay? Then what do you need to do first? Is find the receptive field of the cell. What would constitute the receptive field of the cell? Where should you place this in the visual field with respect to fixation? So here's the fixation. The monkey's fixating here. And you find that, when I move the stimulus, I get to a specific position. Now the cell responds abruptly. That means that's the receptive field of the cell, right? Next thing you want to find is what is the preferred direction of the cell. So similar to what I showed you here, okay, you find what is you move the dots in different directions, and you find what's the optimal direction which elicits the highest firing from the cell. So in this case, it's up and to the right, okay? Okay, so you find the preferred direction of the cell. In this case, it's up, okay? So you present the stimulus at the receptive field in a direction which is either its preferred direction, so in this case up, or in the opposite direction. We call this the null direction. Okay, so typically in the null direction you don't get much firing. In the preferred direction you get strong firing. Okay, and now you do the following. You present the fixation, and then after the monkey establishes fixation, you present the stimulus. Okay, now you want to make sure that when the stimulus is presented, say you're fixating here and I present you a stimulus here. What do you do automatically? Yes, but you want to make sure that that's not the case. Why?
Because you will change the receptive field.
Correct, obviously, right? So the receptive field is determined in retinotopic coordinates. So if you're going to move your eyes from here to here, the receptive field is going to jump accordingly to the right, right? So the monkey needs to maintain fixation here, although the stimulus is presented in the periphery. Okay, so the stimulus is presented, and then that's the tricky part to teach the monkey is, okay, now the monkey has to determine what is the direction of motion. Is it in one direction or the opposite one? So once the stimulus is shown and is turned off, there's these two target LEDs that come up, this one and that one, and the monkey basically tells us which was the direction of motion by making a saccadic eye movement, either to the preferred direction if it was up, or to the null direction if it was down. So that's just a way to convey how did he perceive the stimulus. Okay? So here's what's called the psychometric function. It describes the proportion of correct answers as a function of the correlation of the dots. Remember, so the dots could be 100% correlation. That means they're all moving in one direction. Okay? And it could, you see this is sort of a logarithmic scale. So, this means it's 1% correlation. Only 1% of the dots move in a coherent fashion. The others just move randomly. Okay? And what you can see is, not surprisingly, is that, as you're dropping the level of the dot correlation, performance drops to chance level, right? As you get to 1%, something like that, chance level is 50%, right? You have to say, is it preferred or null at each time? So you see a drop in performance, and this is sort of following sort of a sigmoid, and you can, without going into complete full details, you can sort of determine the threshold here by so this is determined what is the dot correlation needed in order to perform the task at 82%. And I'm not getting into reasons why exactly 82, but basically you see that there's a sigmoid. You can think of this as a sort of an estimation of the threshold. So in this case, it's about 6% coherence. Indeed, 6.1% coherence. But that's the threshold of percent dots that are moving coherently the monkey to say is it going in the preferred direction or the null direction. Okay, now here's the interesting point. We want to compare performance of the monkey with performance of the neurons, because we want to say how sensitive are the neurons. Okay, how are we going to do this? Well, look at what's being plotted here. So let's look at this one first. That just shows the responses of a given neuron. So they're all from one given neuron, okay? So the light bars here correspond to the responses of the cell. So you see this is between 0 and 100 spikes per trial, okay? When the motion is at 12.8% coherence, okay? So the percentage of dots moving coherently are here at 12.8%, okay? And this is when they're moving in the preferred direction. Here, this is where they're moving in the null direction. So 2 points to notice here, okay? First is that you give the same stimulus again and again and again, you don't get the same response. You see, there's a distribution of response. On average, the cell would fire, I don't know, something like 75 spikes per second, or spikes per trial, when you're presenting the stimulus in the preferred direction. And when you're presenting it in the null direction, in the opposite direction, it would fire something like, I don't know, 30 spikes, okay? But there's a distribution. The cells, sort of, there's some random processes at the level of the cell, so sometimes it fires stronger, and sometimes it fires less. Now, when I'm saying random processes, there's all these things that we are unable to determine. Give me some examples. Any ideas that you can think of? Why would the cell not fire the same? You're giving the same stimulus over and over again, and the cell is in sort of a noisy little machine. It's not firing exactly the same, right? Sometimes it's firing more, sometimes it's firing less. Why is that? Well, maybe there's just okay, so there's clearly noise. Some of this noise could be actually signal that we don't understand. For instance, the monkey gets bored with what you're doing, okay? Okay, the monkey's doing this. He's not working for free. He's getting juice or something for each correct response he's giving, okay? At some point, he's, fed up. So he's, and also some of the fluctuation may reflect the motivation of the monkey. Now, we don't have a measure to measure this motivation. And all we see is just the output here. So that may be one reason for this. There's other reasons as well. I'm just giving you some idea. So, point to take home is that the cell itself is a noisy machine. It's not responding the same, even though you're giving the same stimulus over and over again. Okay, now, remember what my goal is. My goal is to say, how sensitive are the cells? Well, the sensitivity of the cells could tell, okay, you have to tell us, think about this, that you're at the other room, listening to the output of the cell, and you have to say, is motion in the preferred direction or the null direction of that cell? Well, in this case, you're going to do quite well. Why? Because there's no overlap between these two distributions. So that's the distribution of responses when it's in the preferred, that's in the null. So if you're going to set a sort of threshold here, you're going to do almost perfectly well. Right? But as you're decreasing the coherence level of the dots, there are fewer dots moving coherently, then you see that this distribution here, the overlap between these two distributions becomes bigger and bigger, meaning that you have a greater problem telling if it is motion in the preferred direction or in the null direction. Everyone with me here? Okay. Now, how can you assess this? So this is basically the intuition behind this. How can you assess this? Have you encountered signal detection theory in other talks before? Or what's called receiver operating curve? Okay, so let me mention this. It's called ROC analysis, or receiver operating curve analysis. And so I'll talk a bit, since this is sort of supposed to be computational. I'm just not getting greatly into this, but I want to sort of give you a feel for this, okay? So here's the distributions we talked about. Remember? That was clear to everyone? It's really important. If you don't understand that, I'll be losing you. Well, let's look at one of them. So I said what you can change, basically, is your criteria for deciding, okay, so I'm going to, well, let's think about this. Let me draw it here. You know, it's simpler to show it here. So let's look at this distribution here. What I can't change is my criterion, okay? So I'm starting from a very high criterion. I'll be saying that, okay, only if the cell fires above 100 spikes, I'll say that this is in the preferred direction. If not, I'll say it's in the null direction. And then I'll relax my criterion, slowly, okay? So as I relax my criterion here, I start with here. And now I'll be marking how many times do I get a hit. A hit meaning that the motion was in the preferred direction, and I said it was in the preferred direction, okay? So you can think about this. Well, I still need to show you this, because that's an important sort of drawing I want to make here. So you have these two distributions here. Okay, that's when it's in the preferred direction, that's in the null direction. That's the frequency, how often this is. And this is spikes per second. This is the firing rate. Spikes per sec, firing rate. Okay, so overall, as I said, the problem is this overlap between these two distributions. No overlap, there's no problem whatsoever. And what I'm doing now is changing my criterion. So I'm starting from here and I'm moving. Okay, so first my criterion here is here. Now we need to think about, let's just think about the criterion at some point, say here. We need to think about 4 different outcomes. Okay? So here's my criterion. What would be a hit? A hit is that my decision is that there was the movement was in the preferred direction when it was in the preferred direction. What would it correspond to here? This area here, right? That would be, that's the chances of a hit. Okay? What would be a miss? A miss is that indeed motion was in the preferred direction while I said it was not in the preferred direction. What would that be? This one here, right? The green one. That would be a miss. Right? Now what would be a false alarm? That I said it was in the preferred direction while it was actually in the null direction. This area here, right? It's above my criterion, so I said it was in the preferred direction, but in fact it was in the null. Okay, so this is the distribution of responses in the null direction. Sometimes, although motion was in the null, the cell is responding strong enough to be above our criterion, right? Okay. And now, as I'm moving, okay, so as I'm moving my criterion from here to here to here to here to here, what am I getting? What am I getting? More hits at the expense of what? More false alarms, right? Okay, exactly. So this here, the y-axis here is the proportion of hits. The x-axis here is a proportion of false alarms, okay? So ideally, now let's take one such graph, I don't know, at whatever, let's look at here, okay? What do we see here? You're changing your criteria from a high criterion to a lower criterion to decide that its movement is in the preferred direction. So ideally, performance would be here, moving from 0 to 1. So the perfect performance is here. Okay, you're here, moving to here, okay? Hits, you're going to have perfect hits, no false alarms. When is that going to be the case? Yeah, when they're completely separate, exactly. When they're completely intertwined, corresponding, what are you going to get? Okay, so take this. Let's say that they're completely corresponding. And you change your criteria from here to here, okay? So they're completely corresponding. As you're increasing the hit rate, you're also increasing by the same amount the false alarm rate. Let me sort of make this the point here. Think about the following. Okay, they're completely overlapping, so I'm drawing the red one, which is for the null direction, and the blue one is for the preferred direction. You're changing your threshold, moving it this way, so you're getting greater and greater area here, but you're getting a greater area both for the false alarms and for the hit rate, right? So you're going to move along the main diagonal here, okay? As you're moving your criteria leftward, you're going to start from 0 here, and you're going to increase, and you're going to move along the main diagonal. So the main diagonal, there's no information whatsoever. And what's important here is, as you're changing your criteria, how do you do, okay? So if the totally separated, you're going to jump and stay at 1. If the totally inseparable, you're going to move along this. So here you have no information. Here you have a complete information, and generally you're looking at the amount of information by the area under this raw curve, okay? So the more it diverges from the main diagonal this way, you have this sort of belly here, the greater the information is, okay? So that's what's called the signal detection theory, and that, if you apply this, you can now compute not just the monkey's performance as we described before, but you can actually compute the cell's performance and ask yourself, okay, what is the proportion of correct answers that you're going to get as a function of the stimulus, the dot correlation? How many of the dots move coherently together, okay? So as you increase this, again, just to make the point, as you increase this, the divergence between these two distributions becomes bigger. And therefore, if you apply the ROC analysis that I described, you're going to get better performance, meaning here that this area under the curve, independent of your criteria, it's going to become bigger and bigger. That's the basics of it, okay? And now you can compare the two, okay? And ask yourself, how good is a cell? How is it in comparison with the monkey's performance? What would be your expectation? That they're the same. Okay, if so, give me a reason why should they be the same, just from the graph I've shown you here. Well, they're almost the same, but why should they be the same? Is that so? I mean, that's the question. Now, you'd think, okay, the monkey's using multitudes of cells, not just one cell. So the monkey, if he's sort of averaging across many, many cells, it should be much better than the individual cell. Well, in fact, it is. In general, some of the cells are just as good as the monkey. So you see here the psychometric curve and what's called the neurometric curve, which is the same function drawn for the neuron. So sometimes they're completely overlapping. Sometimes the neuron's better than the monkey. Sometimes the monkey's better than the neuron. On average, the threshold of the neuron is very similar to the threshold of the monkey. The monkey's a little better, okay, but not great, okay? So if the threshold of the neuron is bigger than the monkey, that means that the monkey's much better, okay? So that would be greater than 1 here, this relationship, this ratio. And if it's lower, that means actually the neuron is better than a monkey. So you see the distribution is somewhat skewed to the right, but generally the average threshold ratio is 1.19, meaning that, you know, the monkey is slightly better than the average cell, but a lot of cells are better than the monkey. Okay? So that's a puzzle here, and we wondered about this. I mean, one can wonder about this. So this is just to show you the neuronal threshold and the psychophysical threshold on an experiment-by-experiment basis. So this was done, I don't know, hundreds of times. And you see each point here corresponds to the threshold of the monkey along the y-axis and the neuron of the x-axis. Now, if they would be corresponding, they should all be lying on the main diagonal here. So you see, sometimes, you know, the monkey is much more sensitive than the neuron, so all these points below the main diagonal, that means that the monkey has a lower threshold than the neuron, so clearly the monkey's better. But sometimes it's above the main diagonal, meaning that, you know, the neuron is in fact actually better than a monkey. Okay, and so how do we understand this? Well, just another thing here to mention is that there's a difference between monkeys. Some monkeys are more sensitive than others, and generally the mean behavioral threshold of the monkeys, so some monkeys are, I mean, if it's high here, it means that they're less sensitive. Low here means that it's more sensitive. There's just 3 points here. But the point is that it corresponds to the mean neuronal threshold. So you can think about this sort of, okay, here's the neuronal threshold. You can ask, okay, what is the mean threshold here of these dots here? If you sort of plot them along the x-axis here, and that would change across monkeys, and that sort of corresponds to the monkey's performance. So that's not a surprise. I mean, the monkey's using its neurons, okay? So some monkeys are more sensitive to motion than others, and that's based on the neuronal population. Of course, there's a few hundreds of neuron hairs, but if it's sort of corresponding to something about the monkey's behavior, that's not a great surprise. But what is a surprise is that the point that I mentioned before is, okay, the monkey can use not just one neuron on 10 neurons or 100 neurons. The monkey can use multitudes, I don't know, millions of neurons. Why doesn't it get better? Okay, so that's one puzzle I want to mention to you. Another puzzle that I want to mention to you is the following. We can look at trials in which motion is completely random. Okay, so the monkey has to say, is it preferred or null direction? Okay, sometimes it's very easy. Sometimes it's very difficult because the percentage of dots moving incoherently is very, very small. Now, in the extreme, it's 0, meaning that the dots are just moving randomly. Okay, the monkey still makes a decision. Is it upward? Is it in the preferred direction or the null direction? Okay, but it's not something, not information that you have in a stimulus. The stimulus itself is completely random. Okay, the motion in the stimulus is completely random. Well, look here. That's just an example from one cell, showing here that's the number of trials, and that's the cell firing rate. And you can say, see here, look at the open dots mean when the monkey said that it's in a preferred direction. So let's say that the cell's preferred direction is upward. Okay, motion is completely random, but the monkey decided that in this case, motion was upward. Now, in another trial, motion was completely random, and the monkey decided for that specific case that motion was downward. Okay? What you see here is that there's a difference. When a monkey decided that motion was upward, it's firing higher than when a monkey decided it's downward. The stimulus, physical stimulus, was the same in both cases. Okay? So that's reflecting the monkey's decisions in some ways. Okay? And you can see here, there's the two distributions. That's when it's in the preferred direction, and that's in the null direction. You see that this one is shifted upwards compared to this. You can see this in the individual dots as well. Okay? What does it mean? It means, okay, that's a big surprise in some ways, because it suggests that the fluctuations in the individual neuron, sometimes it's firing more, sometimes it's firing less, are actually taken into account when the monkey is making a decision. It means that this neuron has an impact on the monkey's decision. Okay? Now, if you are to have millions of neurons, how come one neuron, the fluctuations in one neuron, would affect your decision? Is it going upward or downward? That's surprising, right? Okay, so any ideas how to explain this? Yeah. Maybe there is a correlation between all of them. That's right. Okay. So it's an excellent point. That's what we've come up with. And the idea is, indeed, that the assumption here is that these neurons are independent of one another. So if they're independent of one another, think of the following. You have to decide if motion is upward or downward. Now you have, let's say, these different advisors that tell you up or down, okay? Now, each of them can be is noisy. So his estimate of is it up or down is not perfect, but it has some value to it, okay? So what's your best bet? Is not to ask one, okay, but to ask 1,000, okay? However, if they are correlated, as mentioned here, if one says, okay, in this case it's up, okay, and the other says, depending on what the other said, the first one said, the second one says the same thing, then you haven't gotten anything. That's the case where they're completely correlated, okay? If they're completely correlated, asking 1 or asking 1,000 is the same thing, okay? If there's some correlation between them, well, you're going to gain something, okay? But you're not going to gain as much as if they're uncorrelated. If they're uncorrelated, you can basically get rid of the noise by asking more and more advisors. How do you get rid of the noise? Okay, you get rid of the noise as a function of the square root of n. You're familiar with this in the central limit theorem in statistics. That's where it derives from. I mean, the analogy is you have a coin and you have to decide is it skewed or not. Okay, you throw it once, it's opali. You throw it again, you throw it again. You throw it 1,000,000 times. What are the chances that you're going to get something around half? Well, if it's non-skewed, your mean. Okay, so the distribution should be Gaussian, as you know, okay? And when you're increasing the number of trials, your distribution is still going to be Gaussian, but the standard deviation is going to decrease. Okay, it's called the standard error of the mean. And the standard error of the mean, how does it decrease? It decreases as a function of 1 over n. Okay, the standard deviation is standard error of the mean is related to 1 over square root of n. Sorry, did I say 1 over n? Square root of n, okay? So, you're going to gain as a square root of n if they're independent of one another. However, okay, if they're dependent, it's a different story. So let's think of the analogies that I've just explained to you. Let's think of a simple model for motion detection in which you have these neurons which are U1 to UN would correspond to neurons which are sensitive to upward motion, and D1 to DN would be sensitive to downward motion. Okay? So you take the signal from the upward ones, you take the signal, you pull the signal of the downward one, and you compare the two. If this one is bigger than this one, then you're saying it's upward. If this one is bigger than this one, you're saying it's downward. Sounds simple enough, right? And now, the more you're going to pull, if they're uncorrelated, the problem that we talked about, this distribution, the overlap of the two distributions is going to become smaller, right? Okay, so that's basically the idea here. However, if you have a correlation between the neurons, then how are you going to sort of notice it? Well, you need to record from two neurons in the same time. So let's say these are two neurons that are sensitive to upward motion. And here you see the firing rate of neuron 1 as a function of the firing rate of neuron 2 as a function of firing rate of neuron 1. If they're uncorrelated, what should it look like? So these are different trials here. This is trial number 1, where neuron 1 fired this amount of spikes, this one fired that amount of spikes. You give the same stimulus again, here's the firing, neuron 1, neuron 2, and so on and so forth. If they were to be uncorrelated, what should this cloud look like? A Gaussian, two-dimensional Gaussian like that. If they're completely correlated, what should it look like? A line, exactly, a line like that. Okay? Now, they're not completely correlated, but they're not totally uncorrelated because there's some structure here. You can see that this is sort of going upward, correct? Okay? Suggesting that there's a weak correlation between the two. Indeed, the correlation between neurons is changing depending on your recording, but generally it's of the order of 0.1, the correlation coefficient, 0.1. Okay. No correlation is 0. Maximum correlation is 1. So 0.1 is very weak, right? But if you do the math and you do some simple analysis, which I don't have time to get into here, you can show, so what do we see here? The numbers here correspond to the number of neurons that you're using to arrive at a decision. So it could be 1 neuron here, it could be 100, it could be 10,000, so on and so forth. And the y-axis here is your signal-to-noise ratio. So the bigger it is, the more you're sure about your decision. Well, what I just told you before, if they're uncorrelated, how should the signal-to-noise change as a function of the number of neurons that you're using? As a square root of n, right? So you see here, as you're moving from 1 to 100 neurons, the signal-to-noise should change from 1 to 10, right? Because so it's an increase of 10 for an increase of 100 in terms of the number of neurons. And again, if you were to go from 100 to 10,000, another multiplication by 100, it should go again by a function, increase by another tenfold increase. Okay, so it's linear if you plot this in a log-log scale. However, what you see is that if you have a correlation between these neurons, as I showed here. So the firing rate of one neuron is actually determines the firing rate of the other neurons to some extent, weak extent. Well, you can see that as you're increasing the number of neurons, you're actually getting to an asymptote. You're not getting any better, okay? Even if your correlation is very, very weak, of the order of 0.1. So the dashed lines here correspond to what our assumption is, or our measures are, in terms of the correlation, interneuron correlations. And the signal-to-noise ratio is getting better. It's going from 1 to maybe 2 or 3 threefold. But it's, as you're increasing the number of neurons that are playing part in your decision, it gets to an asymptote, doesn't improve anymore, okay? So the take-home message here is that you could use 100 neurons, 10,000 neurons, 1 million neurons, or 1 billion neurons. At some point, you get to an asymptote, and very, very quickly, okay? Now, the other point I want to mention, this is where I'll stop, is that it's the same when you're sort of looking at, again, the number of neurons on the x-axis. Here, it's the correlation between the individual neuron and the pool of neurons. So our assumption is that you don't base your decision on one neuron, neither on 100, but many, many neurons. We don't know how many, but many, many neurons. And the point here is that you're saying, okay, remember that I told you that the actual individual neuron is fluctuating from trial to trial, okay? And its fluctuations, let me just show you again here, reflect the decision of the monkey, not the visual stimulus, the decision of the monkey. So it suggests that the individual neuron has a component, a relevant component in the decision. And that sounds weird, right? If you use 1 million neurons, why would you care about the fluctuations of the individual neurons? What you care about is the overall response of these 1 million neurons, okay? Well, but if they fluctuated together, then that would be not such a surprise. Remember that when I told you that you have these advisors. Well, if one advisor is firing above its firing mean, and the second one is also, when the first one does, it also fires above its mean. So they all say the same thing, okay? But you don't gain much from listening to the million advisors rather than the one, okay? That's one point. And the other is that the fluctuations of the individual advisor are going to be seen also in the population, right? Because they're correlated. They're moving together. They're going up and down together, okay? So the correlation means that if you listen to one advisor, it's actually going to give you information about what the decision of the population will be, okay? And that's shown here. It shows, okay, so the y-axis here is the relationship between the individual neurons, and you can think about the pool, the whole population, okay? So there's a relationship between the neuron and the whole population because they're correlated together, okay? And that's shown here. So as you increase the number of neurons, okay, even if the correlation is very weak, so these are the plots here for a correlation of 0.1 or so, okay? So here's the line for correlation of 0.05, and these are the dashed lines here are for a correlation of 0.1 or so, which is what we find physiologically, and it shows that you're going this asymptotes as well, meaning that you expect to find a relationship between the fluctuations of the individual neuron and the monkey's decision. So that's not a surprise either, okay? So the two main findings that we found which were surprising. One, the neurons were very sensitive. Two, that their individual fluctuations were reflected in the decision of the monkey, okay? So here, There's no change in the visual stimulus, okay? But when the fluctuation, the cell fires above its mean, the monkey tends to say it's in the preferred direction. Cells fires below, the monkey says it's in a null direction. So it's manifesting the decision of the monkey, not the visual stimulus. So both of these could be explained by the correlation, by the correlation between the single neurons on a trial-by-trial basis. This correlation is weak, but although it's weak, it has a great effect. Okay? I think we'll finish now. I'll continue with this in the next talk. להתראות. זה לא מוצלח מבחינת, למה יש קורלציה? תחשוב. אתה צודק, כאילו רק למה המערכת לא התפתחה מבחינת האנטומיה. זה קורלציה של הנויז. אוקיי, אם תאים מקבלים, תחשוב אותה, שאלה מצוינת, נכון, זו שאלה הבאה. אתה אומר, יש לך איזשהו תא, הוא מקבל אינפוטים מהתאים האלה. והתא השני מקבל אינפוטים, מרוב התאים הוא מקבל גם כזה. עכשיו, אם אלה, אם האינפוט הוא משותף, אז אוקיי, הרעש שיש לך ברמת האינפוט הוא משותף לשניהם. אתה מבין? אז חלק מהעניין זה בגלל שכאילו האנטומיה מכוונת את זה. common input זה אומר common noise, זה לא רק common signal, זה גם common noise.
כאילו זה בעצם משקף את הקורלציה ברעש כבר בשכבה הראשונה?
לא, אני אומר ככה, תחשוב על זה, גם אם זה אלם אנקורלטית אחד מהשני. תדבר על התא הזה, הוא מקבל את האינפוט מזה ומזה. אוקיי? וזה מקבל אינפוט מהיחידות הדומות. יש הרבה מאוד חפיפה באינפוטים, וחפיפה באינפוטים נובעת מזה שזה אותו רספקטיב, זה די ברור שצריך להיות שכן. עכשיו תחשוב שהאינפוטים האלה הם רועשים. הם רועשים, לא אותו דבר. אז הרעש, שזה נגיד יותר חזק, הוא משפיע גם על תא מספר 1, אבל הוא גם משפיע באותה מידה על תא מספר 2. פעם הבאה, אותו תא מגיב חלש, אז הוא ישפיע על זה שזה תא 1 יגיב יותר חלש, וגם תא 2 יגיב יותר חלש. אז עכשיו הם זזים ביחד, מפעד אחד.
אבל הקורלציה ביניהם היא 0? בין הרעשים שלהם?
לא הנחתי שום דבר לגבי אלה, הם לא חייבים להיות. בעצם זה, שזה שולח את האינפוט שלו, גם לתא 1 וגם לתא 2, אז פלוקטואציות פה יבואו לידי ביטוי פלוקטואציות של שניהם ביחד.
כן, אני מבין, אבל נראה לי, אני לא בטוח, שאם הקורלציה ביניהם היא 0, אז אפשר לבנות מודל לפחות אידיאלי, שלא יהיה רע.
לא נכנסתי, חלק מהעניין זה לנסות לבנות, כאילו, אחד הדברים שנכון זה decorrelation, אחד הדברים שהיה מוצלח לעשות מבחינת, כאילו, לעשות decorrelation, לעשות מצב שאין קורלציה בין האינפוטים. ברלו וזה, כאילו, עבדו על הדברים האלה. השאלה כמה זה אפשרי מבחינת האנטומיה, זו שאלה אחרת, אוקיי? האנטומיקל קונסטרנט. אבל אתה צודק שבאופן עקרוני זה ברור שקורלציה פה מגבילה את הביטוי. אז דקורלציה הייתה עוזרת פה לביטוי. אוקיי, נדבר על זה.
שאלה קשורה?
כן.
הנוירונים הפחות סנסיטיביים, כאילו יש להם יתרונות אחרים? למה בכלל...
למה יש נוירונים שהם יותר סנסיטיביים ופחות סנסיטיביים? אתה שואל, למה כאילו, מה פתאום יש נוירונים שהם אינסנסיטיביים? זה השאלה?
משהו כזה.
מה שקורה את הסנסיטיביטי שלהם זה האינפוט שהם מקבלים. עוד פעם, זה קשור לאנטומיה, אז אתה יודע, בחלק מהמקרים, אוקיי...
כן, אבל אם אין להם שום יתרון, אז לא יודע, זה לפחות שהייתה איזושהי מערכת של ריוורד שהקוף היה לומד מתישהו...
לא, זה לא נכון. בוא נגיד ככה, אם הם לא לחלוטין רועשים, אז ברור שלצרף אותם אתם איזושהי אינפורמציה ביחס למצב אפס. נכון? אז צריך קצת משקל יותר נמוך. אוקיי, נוירונים...
אני יודע שבסוף הקוף הרבה פחות טוב מהנוירונים.
כן, אז אתה אומר, הקוף הוא פחות טוב מהרבה נוירונים, אולי בגלל שהוא מסכן. מה שהייתי מציג את זה אחרת. למה הקוף הוא לא טוב כמו הנוירון הכי טוב? למה לא תתן משקלות רק לאלה הכי טובים, ואחרי האלה שלא טובים, אתה עושה למשקל אפס, נכון? אלה שבטח פחות ממוצע. אז יש כל השאלה אם אפשר לעשות את זה טוב, כאילו, אתה תעשה איזושהי מערכת, אתה עושה מוניטורינג, שמה המצב של הנוירון הזה, כן?
יכול להיות שזה כאילו משתנה
יכול להיות לא, יכול להיות שבעצם ההחלטה מבוססת על האוכלוסייה, ואין לעקוף דרך לדעת מי זה הזה שאמר את התשובה הכי נכונה, כאילו לעשות מוניטורינג. אז הדרך שלו זה לקחת אוכלוסייה גדולה של נוירון, ואז מחסה לקבל את ההחלטה.
אבל אין נוירון קבוע שהוא כאילו הגרף הזה שהראית הוא...
לא, זה תלוי בתנועה, אם התנועה היא בכיוון מסוים ובמהירות מסוימת אז יהיה נוירון אחד, תתן משהו אחר זה יהיה נוירון אחר. אוקיי, נתחיל מזה, זה עבור גירוי מסוים. אבל עדיין...
בגלל שהם סנסיטיביים יותר לתנועה אחרת.
זה חלק מהעניין, לא בהכרח. גם יש התפלגות באופן טבעי, אוקיי? כשאתה שואל, רגע, למה הכוח הוא נותן להם משקל? זה מה שאתה שואל. יכול מאוד להיות שהוא לא יודע, אין לו את היכולת לדעת מי זה הנוירון שהוא הכי אמין ומי זה הנוירון שהוא לא אמין. זו שאלה לא ברורה אם אנחנו נתייחס לזה בשיעור, בדיוק על זה נדבר בשיעור הבא. בסדר? זה בסוף נקודה חשובה שנחזור. בסדר?